Today's webinar. My name is Matt Bowen. I'm a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Let me first quickly say that this event is being webcast live. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matt Bowen. I'm a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Let me quickly say that this event is being webcast live, and a recording of the full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you joining via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. As a reminder, our events are closed captioned. You can turn the captions on by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and then selecting show subtitles. Today, we're going to be discussing reactor costs and decarbonization efforts. We are lucky enough to have with us the CEO of Tennessee Valley Authority, Jeff Lyash, to give us a utility level view on the challenges associated with decarbonization efforts in the TVA area and nuclear power's potential role there. Then we'll have a discussion on the general topic with 4 panelists who will share their perspectives on various aspects of U.S. cost overruns in the past, how costs could be controlled and reduced in the future, and the potential role of nuclear energy in decarbonization efforts if we can make progress on costs. Then we will take questions from the audience. But first, I'd like to introduce Mr. Jeff Lyash, who is the CEO and president of Tennessee Valley Authority, which is the nation's largest public utility and has a diverse energy portfolio that includes nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, coal, and natural gas. Previous to heading up TVA, he was the president and CEO of Ontario Power Generation, one of the largest electric generating companies in Canada with a similarly diverse portfolio that includes nuclear, hydro, natural gas, wind, and solar. I can't really do justice to his entire biography in a short amount of time, but I will note 2 other positions. He was also a vice president at Duke Energy, another large U.S. utility, and back in the 1980s, he worked at the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So Jeff, thank you for taking time to be here with us today, and I appreciate in advance your thoughts on this topic.
Well, thank you very much, and I certainly appreciate the invitation to make a few remarks. So let me touch on these topics, but first, let me make sure your listeners and participants have a little bit of an idea of what TVA is. So TVA was established in 1933. So we are the largest public power provider in the U.S. We serve approximately 10 million people across 7 southeastern states. In terms of scale, we're the 3rd largest producer of electricity in the country, one of the largest transmission systems, and we operate the 3rd largest nuclear fleet in the country. A bit more about that. But probably importantly for this discussion, we operate one of the nation's largest, most diverse clean generation portfolios, including that 3rd largest nuclear fleet. That nuclear fleet consists of 7 units, and in the last quarter of this year, that fleet produced 47% of the terawatt hours that our customers consumed. That's an all-time record for us as we've worked very hard to optimize, leverage, and next extend that nuclear fleet for the benefit of our customers. And importantly, that nuclear fleet performed exceptionally well during severe weather that we've seen in the last year, both heat in the summer and flawlessly in the extreme cold weather we saw in January, when TVA successfully served by a significant margin the highest peak loads we've ever seen on the system and the most amount of energy we've ever provided in a 7-day period in TVA's 90-year history. And if I focus on that fleet for just a second, it's not only carbon-free and reliable, it's also our 2nd lowest cost energy source. It is just above our hydro fleet in terms of its cost effectiveness. At TVA, we're driving to be a clean energy leader. So we've taken actions to reduce our carbon emissions against the 2005 baseline by nearly 60%. Nearly 60% of our energy currently comes from 0 carbon sources: wind, solar, hydro, nuclear. And we've got a line of sight on how to reduce our carbon emissions to about 80% less than that 2005 benchmark by 2035. Now, we'd like to go farther faster, but I'm an engineer, so I've got to have line of sight on it so that when I promise you we can do it, I know we can deliver it. And so we're looking for how to move that faster if we can, and how to extend it beyond the 80% reduction. So in our current plan, how are we doing that? Well, it's certainly through optimizing and extending our existing nuclear fleet, our hydro fleet, deploying a substantial amount of renewable energy, primarily in the form of solar. And by 2035, we will have retired our coal assets. We're actively in the process of doing it now. So as we try to work through this, our reliability remains high, 5 nines, and our rates, we need to remain low. Right now, we're lower than 70% of the large utilities in the country in terms of our rate for retail customers, and lower than 95% of the country for industrial rates, a key to economic development. Now, to help decarbonize that last 20% affordably and sustainably, while we see increasing electricity load, we believe our terawatt hour sales will double between now and 2050. Double. What that means is in 90 years, we built the system, and we have to build another system, even as we transition the old in the next 2 decades. And while we do that, and that will be driven, we think, in large part due to low carbon electricity being used in other segments of the economy to decarbonize those segments. I'd suggest, if you haven't, that you take a look at our website. We recently sponsored a year-long study with the University of Tennessee Baker Center. It's called Valley Carbon Pathways Study. And it looks economy-wide at carbon emissions in the valley. What are the drivers and what are the pathways to economy-wide decarbonization? And so clearly, we're going to need more affordable, reliable, resilient, and carbon-free generation to meet the intersection of these challenges. So we're executing a clean energy strategy that's focused on, as I said, preserving and extending the operating life of our existing nuclear fleet, achieving best-in-class performance in that fleet, and developing advanced nuclear technologies to complement the rest of the clean energy agenda we're working, which includes making strategic investments in building out this energy system of the future. We've got 10,000 megawatts of solar targeted by 2035. We're continuing to develop emerging technologies like long duration energy storage, potentially hydrogen as a low carbon fuel for our gas fleet, carbon capture technologies that might become viable. And so this is going to require investment, development, and deployment of all these technologies. Now, turning to nuclear, when I look at this growing need for more carbon-free, dependable energy, frankly, I can't make the reliable, affordable, and carbon-free math work without nuclear. Advanced nuclear as a dispatchable 24/7 carbon-free resource, along with the grid service that it brings, can help enhance the integration of other variable and intermittent clean energy renewables such as solar. And it's a key component of affordability and sustainability as we go after those goals. So in addition to optimizing the existing fleet specifically, we focus on light water small modular reactors and advanced nuclear technology generation 4 type reactors in our strategy. We see light water small modular reactors as the technology that's ready for deployment in the near term. And by that, I mean in the 2030s. Development now, deployment at scale, multiple units in the 2030s as we continue to drive toward generation 4 fission technologies and hopefully someday hydrogen fusion. What we're focused on are units that have a capacity to generate about 300 megawatts of electricity. This is much smaller than the gigawatt scale reactors we've traditionally built in the country. So the benefits of small modular reactors is that they are simpler. They are passive in design, far less systems, far less concrete, piping, valves, cabling, and much more able to sustain through any event without relying on extreme actions. The operation of these should lead to more reliable and simple design, at nth of a kind, shorter construction schedules, lower cost, and over time, we think they'll be very cost effective to build. We're focused right now on the Clinch River site, where we have the first and only early site permit in the nation for small modular reactors from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The site is located in East Tennessee, just outside Knoxville, near the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and we in fact have a partnership with ORNL in the areas of nuclear fission and fusion. Right now, we're preparing a construction permit application for this design, which we expect to submit to the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission sometime in mid-24, so within just a few months. Partnership is important here. So we've formed a partnership with GE Hitachi, who are the technology providers, Ontario Power, who's deploying a similar design at their Darlington site near Toronto, and Synthos Green Energy from Poland, who has identified 10 sites in Poland, the most carbon-intense country in Europe, for deployment of small modular reactors. TVA up to this point has authorized investment of about $250 million in this preparatory work, and it's a very disciplined, gated process so that as we evaluate the technology, the licensing, and the construction estimates and schedules, we can make very, very measured decisions. We are, what I'd like to see is a reliable, low-cost, flexible, and clean advanced reactor option commercialized and deploying at scale in the 2030s. And we think the Clinch River project could be a catalyst for that. However, I will say it is important to have a realistic view of cost and time to construct estimates. I have experience building all types of assets around the world, and I can just tell you, first of a kind technologies are inherently expensive. Has risk, and they're challenging to execute. This will be no different with SMRs. And so I think it's important to be realistic, because the investment to be made here is not in building one reactor, but it's in building the first of a kind, and then with intent and systematically using that experience to drive to nth of a kind, so that this technology can have the kind of material impact it needs to have in the 2030s and beyond. I believe that TVA has the project discipline and the technical expertise to do this. We've got experience managing large projects. Up until recently, TVA was the only company in North America to bring a new reactor online in the 21st century. That was our second unit at Watts Bar. Many congratulations to my friends at Southern Company for finishing Vogtle's units 3 and 4 just in the past number of months. We've also completed successful extended power uprates at our Browns Ferry units and steam generator replacements at Watts Bar and Sequoia stations. And at any given time, TVA has around 900 active projects totaling about $12 billion in flight associated with our non-nuclear generation and transmission assets. When looking at Clinch River, as I said, we have been following, are going to continue to follow a very disciplined, gated decision-making process to ensure that our desire to do this doesn't outpace our plan and our realistic assessment. And I might add that we also have 50 years worth of operating experience with our GE BWR boiling water reactor units at Browns Ferry. And the BWRX 300 that we're planning to build at Clinch River, the X stands for the 10th generation. So it is really a 10th generation of the boiling water reactor that we're operating in Alabama, which is arguably the second or third generation of this reactor design. These designs can leverage the existing nuclear supply chain, the existing fuel supply chain. They are of a scale that can be implemented on the current industrial base. Very few one-of-a-kind components here, mostly available at current industrial scale. And they can utilize that 50 years worth of operating experience to evolve this design. We're investing in this design due to its evolutionary design relationship, as I said, to existing operating plants. Its unit output at 300 megawatts, its footprint and output are easily integrated into the transmission system and deployable on existing coal sites that are suitable for this type of deployment without a lot of additional infrastructure investment. As I said, this comes certainly with risk, and to offset the risk, it's why we formed these partnerships with the technology provider, with our partners here, OPG and Synthos Green Energy, and with the industry. For example, we're working with EPRI each step of the way, the Electric Power Research Institute, to capture the process we're using and write the new nuclear playbook that others can utilize as we try to blaze this trail. In fact, on this partnership last March, we announced what we call a technical collaboration agreement with those partners, OPG, Synthos, GE Hitachi, to jointly fund the standard design and the detailed design, including the reactor pressure vessel and internals. In this partnership, each contributor is funding their share of that overall cost. And together, we are participants in a design-centered working group with the purpose of very actively engaging in this design process to make sure it is one standard design deployable across those multiple jurisdictions. In fact, the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, and the Polish nuclear regulator have also formed a collaboration centered on this design to, again, make sure that one design meets each of their regulatory requirements and is constructible, hopefully without modification in all those jurisdictions. That's an important concept because it gives us a scale of the business, a book of business, if you will, for the component suppliers that will help them commit the capital to evolve that supply chain quickly in support of this effort. The agreement allows us to work together to mitigate the financial risk that comes with deployment of any innovative technology, as well as future design costs. In the context of new nuclear, if TVA moves forward with an advanced nuclear project, we might benefit from the direct pay provisions of the IRA for the investment tax credit or the production tax credit. You might recall the IRA includes potentially up to a 40% investment tax credit for this type of project. That helps to offset some of the first-of-a-kind cost and risk. Looking at the larger picture financially, the financial community continues to show interest in new nuclear. In January, the Nuclear Energy Institute hosted a nuclear financing summit that brought together the industry, the developers, and the private investment community, and more than 200 interests attended that. On the agenda were some of the leading investment firms in the country. Think about Brookfield, Bank of America, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley. Attendees at the NEI event discussed that while challenges remain in commercializing new nuclear technology, the potential benefits are enormous, and that nuclear is a critical part of decarbonization. We're also seeing a very rapidly growing interest from potential customers beyond utilities. Think about data centers, big tech, the chemical industry, steel manufacturers. These companies are interested not only in reliable, clean nuclear energy for 24/7, 365 days a year, but there's also a growing sense of willingness to invest. Because these businesses realize that to decarbonize their business, they need infrastructure of this sort, and they're willing to help be a catalyst for that. So in conclusion, I would just say to you that, we are committed to building out a fleet of renewables, to adding the storage technologies that make sense, to leveraging our existing nuclear and hydro assets as much as possible. And the gas fleet that we're building to transition off of coal and to integrate those renewables, we're committing to ensure that it's ready to blend clean hydrogen if it becomes available, and to backfit carbon capture as that technology matures. But that is just, there's a limit to the amount of impact we can have with that collection that is less than what we need. And so that is why we're focused on new nuclear at an appropriate scale, because it's key to our energy security and meeting our clean energy commitments. And it's my view that collaboration and partnership around investment, around risk, lessons learned, and engaging both our suppliers and the ultimate customers for this product is a cornerstone to achieving success in advanced nuclear. I don't doubt that we can build these plants, that we can be successful and drive them to an nth of a kind cost with the right commitment, or that it would be very important, if not critical, for our energy future. I think the contemporary issue is how to form the partnerships between utilities like TVA, technology suppliers, the federal and state government, and the ultimate user to gain the commitment and the support to make this happen. So with that, I'll close. I appreciate you offering me the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you today, and hopefully it'll generate some robust discussion over the course of the rest of the webinar.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Lyash, for that perspective. I think that sets us up very well for the rest of our discussion. And for those who joined late, Jeff is the president and CEO of Tennessee Valley Authority. And thank you again for your time.
Okay. Thank you. Y'all take care.
Okay. We'll now hear from our four panelists. We'll open up to questions from the audience in a little bit. For those of you joining via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Jacopo Bongiorno is director of the Center on Advanced Nuclear Energy Systems at MIT. Julie Kazaraki is a senior advisor in the Department of Energy Loan Programs Office. Shannon Bragg-Sitton is the director for the Integrated Energy and Storage Systems Division at the Idaho National Laboratory. And Carl Hausker is a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute. They all have much longer bios, which you can find online, but in the interest of time, let's just get to them instead. So Jacobo, let's start with you. Nuclear has this mixed history in the United States, including reactor builds and the previous round of construction back in the 70s and 80s in particular, that regularly went over schedule and budget. You and some co-authors wrote a paper a few years ago that looked at some of the sources of those cost overruns. Could you tell our listeners what you found?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for inviting me. And can you hear me and see me well?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. So I think that the short answer is that between the late 1980s and the early 2010s, the nuclear industry and the nuclear regulators in the United States and Europe did not build any new nuclear power plants. And quite simply, they lost the know-how to do it. The situation is quite different if you look at where the center of gravity, so to speak, of the nuclear industry has shifted, which is Asia. Think about China, South Korea, even India, Russia to an extent. They routinely deliver new nuclear power plants on schedule, and from what we can gather in terms of data in the public domain, at reasonable cost. But now coming back to the to this side of the world, in our study, which are summarized in the paper that you mentioned, and also in an earlier report, which was the culmination of the MIT study on the future of nuclear energy in a carbon-constrained world, we came up with a number of specific root causes or reasons for the cost overruns and schedule delays that we've been observing here in the US and Europe. The first is that the projects on both sides of the Atlantic really started without a high share of detailed design completion for the reactors that were being built. In Europe is the EPR. And think about the projects in Finland, Olkiluoto, as well as Flamanville, and even Hinkley Point in the UK. They all started with less than 50% design completed. And this actually points to an important piece of information that Jeff also emphasized, and that's the need for standardization. It's interesting. I learned from colleagues in Europe that Hinkley Point, which is 2 units EPR in the UK, actually started several years after Olkiluoto and Flamanville in Finland and France, respectively. After going through the licensing process in the UK, they identify 1,600 design changes. And that's for a design that at that time was considered sort of done, sealed, frozen, at least in France and in Finland. So first thing is, rushing to construction without having a complete design. Of course, that's a source of delays and cost overruns, because if you make substantial changes during construction, you need to go back to the regulator and make sure that those changes are approved. And if you have, thousands of people at a construction site, you essentially are freezing the project, but you're still paying the workforce, you're still paying the suppliers and all of that. The second is that supply chain was not ready after 2-3 decades of inactivity. Particularly the suppliers of nuclear grade components. There are several examples in AP1000 of large modules that were not manufactured to satisfactory quality to be actually integrated in the project. And inexperienced workforce, although when you think about, certified welders, electricians, etc., the cycle for developing that workforce is relatively short, 2-3 years. So it's key, but it's not absolutely critical path. I'm thinking mostly about experienced construction managers. If you look at the experience in China, you have relatively young construction managers in the mid to late 30s, and they're already gone through 2 or 3 nuclear projects. Here in the US, we don't have that cadre of experienced construction managers that can manage a large project such as that one. And then the third point that I will emphasize is a relatively lack of integration of fabricators and constructors in the design team to begin with. It's very important to design something to be built that is constructible from the very beginning. And if you have sort of a separation between companies that develop the technology and companies that actually build the plant, then the likelihood of designing something that requires changes during construction and iterations between the developer and the supply chain is higher. So in a nutshell, a number of reasons, but really the root cause is that for 3 decades, the industry didn't build anything. And when they restarted, when they decided to restart, they weren't ready.
Okay, and Julie, thank you, Jacopo. And Julie, you were part of this Loan Programs Office report from not too long ago that delved into contributing factors to the AP1000 cost overruns. Is there anything you want to add to what we just heard? And maybe also, if you want to talk about, how do we do better in the future?
Sure thing. So a quick plug on the liftoff reports. They are a cross-DOE effort. So LPO is a huge part, but they're also collaboration with the Office of Nuclear Energy, Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, Office of Technology Transitions, available at liftoff.energy.gov. And so I think that oftentimes people take the wrong lessons away from Vogtle. I often hear people saying that it means that we shouldn't be building big reactors anymore, but it means quite the opposite. To me, first of kind anything is always hard, and these are solvable problems. So we muscled through a lot of those very difficult first of a kind challenges, and we should be capitalizing on those hard-won lessons by building 10 or 20 more. I also think it's important for folks to remember that as excited as I am about both SMRs and microreactors, each of which have individual value propositions, we did make the reactors bigger on purpose. And I think that Jeff brought up a really compelling point around the unprecedented load growth that we've seen coming out just in the last few months. And that has really changed the equation for big reactors. So I will say that probably the most serious conversations I've had with utilities over the past 3 months have been about building more AP1000s. And that's for a number of reasons. So one of those is assessing, first of all, with Vogtle, how much was overrun versus how much was underestimation. And actually, Jeff, when he was at Progress Energy, was testifying that Vogtle was going to be at least a $25 billion project versus the estimate of 14 at the time. Because if the design wasn't complete, how could you really estimate what the cost was going to be? And so there are, I think, a number of ways to think about the cost buckets of Vogtle. And so the 3 big ones that I'll lay out here, and we're hoping to address this more in the update to the liftoff report coming out in a few months, is you have a number of true first-of-a-kind, non-recurring costs that couldn't happen again. So for example, the design wasn't complete, it's complete now. You also had a set of sort of, project management or early-of-a-kind things that could be perhaps managed poorly again, like not having an integrated resource-loaded schedule at the outset. So you would need to make sure that you can incorporate those going forward. And then you have your true early unit cost. And I think it's really compelling to look at even the difference between Unit 3 and Unit 4 at Vogtle, where by many accounts, it's upwards of a 30% cost reduction just between Unit 3 and 4 at Vogtle. And some of those are due to a number of the supply chain factors that Jeff mentioned. At the outset, there wasn't a supply chain stood up. They also had a, challenge in finding and training qualified workers. And in the process of building Vogtle, we've now trained up 13,000 folks at Vogtle. I also think understanding the impact of NRC Part 52 is important, because Part 52 is meant for streamlining a completed design. But when the design wasn't complete, every time you found something in the field that was different than on paper, you had to go back to the NRC and start a long process and go through that again and again. So I think that folks should understand that building another AP1000, perhaps even at the Vogtle site, would definitionally avoid a number of these costs and difficulties that Vogtle went through. But that is not to say that there wouldn't still need to be a lot of upfront planning and discipline put into the project management of another project going forward. The last point I'll make here is also underscoring how much of these issues were general mega project construction issues versus, nuclear being some type of unique boondoggle. And so I always recommend the book, How Big Things Get Done. And I think that that book, although it has some pretty stark data on nuclear projects, to me gives me hope that these are solvable problems and that a huge part of this is standardizing and repeating, and that we have 93 operating reactors in the US, but we never really got past fourth of a kind because we kept changing and customizing. And so we never have gotten to yet benefit from building at scale and learning by doing. So no matter which designs a customer selects moving forward, what's essential is having at least, call it 5 to 10 within that design. And you can have any color you want as long as it's black. So I really hope that as folks look forward, they consider the suite, not just of microreactors, SMRs, but of the real role that big reactors, and in particular, the AP1000, given everything the folks at Southern Company, Georgia Power, and the ratepayers have put into it for everyone to benefit for going forward.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think, Shannon, if whether it's big reactors, small reactors, micro reactors, if we can get a better handle on these costs and schedules, I know Idaho National Laboratory looks at the sort of role or roles nuclear could potentially play in supporting decarbonization efforts in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about why having a sort of advanced nuclear energy option would be useful?
Yeah, absolutely. First, thank you, Matt, for the opportunity to join this discussion. I've already learned a lot from my co-panelists. I always enjoy these types of platforms. Before I really answer that question, I'd like to back up just a little bit to ask why we even care. Why are we here? Why are we having this conversation? And it's really because we have set out some extremely aggressive goals around decarbonization, and that spans globally, federal governments, local municipalities, private industry. And as we look to those decarbonization solutions, we do need to look beyond just the capital cost of building a new generator. In the United States, that goal to decarbonize our electricity sector has been set for 2030. That's really soon. That's right around the corner. And when we look to these solutions, we as a society tend to think first about electricity when we evaluate those solutions. But we have to keep in mind that coming right behind that is a goal to achieve net zero economy-wide by 2050. So this includes sectors like transportation and industry. And some of the options for transportation and industrial processes do lend themselves to electrification. But this will further lead to increases in electricity demand, meaning more and more clean energy will be needed to address those demands. Other processes are more energy intensive and require high quality heat, which will be much harder to abate. So we don't have the luxury to consider just one or two options to be successful in achieving these goals. We really need to look at that full portfolio of clean energy options. And nuclear energy will play an essential role in that future energy mix. The fraction being contributed by each of these energy sources will be different in different regions. It will be different based on electricity demand, based on heat demands, based on the overall portfolio of generation options available in a particular region. But I'd like to remind everyone that nuclear energy primarily produces heat. Now, typically, in the way we currently operate our nuclear plants, we convert that to electricity. But we can also use that heat directly, incorporating perhaps a secondary or tertiary loop into the system to ensure that we fully isolate the nuclear primary from any downstream heat users. And we also need to remember that nuclear energy is dispatchable, meaning we can provide that energy when it's needed, regardless of that weather. And we have a demonstrated extremely high capacity factor in the US that's greater than 92% fleet-wide. So what does that mean? That means that nuclear power can provide significant value to both a reliable, resilient grid, and it can also support those growing energy demands for industrial processes. Now, that could include the production of clean hydrogen and all the downstream applications of that hydrogen. I'd love to talk more about what those may be. Also, the production of synthetic liquid fuels that will have a lower carbon footprint because it is essentially beginning to close the carbon cycle, a lower carbon footprint than the traditional diesel and jet fuels that we need for heavy-duty transportation. And then we can also begin looking at chemicals manufacturing, metals processing, fertilizer production, and even more. So as we look to our energy solutions, considering the demands for energy across all of our energy use sectors in parallel, I truly believe we can find potentially more efficient solutions from multiple perspectives. So meaning looking at how those energy sources can support the grid in parallel with industry, in parallel with transportation. By doing so, we can find efficiencies in energy utilization, avoiding some of what we see now in operational conditions where we have underuse of installed capacity when we have times of ample renewable production or low demand. We can instead redirect dispatchable energy, such as that from nuclear, to hydrogen production, water purification, or some of these other applications. We can also see efficiencies in overall system cost. So what I mean by that is the overall cost of providing electricity to customers beyond the costs associated with that power plant itself. These system costs aren't fully recognized by many of our energy planning tools or our current market structures, and so they're often overlooked when we look at the lowest cost generation option. And this is critical to ensuring efficient deployment of generation and efficient utilization. We can also look for efficiencies in resource utilization overall. One of the most outstanding areas of resource utilization is land. When we look at how much land we have available, growing demands for electricity, we really need to look at the footprint associated with the energy supply. And when we look at that, nuclear energy for the equivalent amount of energy produced would take about 1.3% of the land required for solar photovoltaics, or 0.3% of the land required for a wind installation. So those are significant. We need to look at energy resource utilization, such as that which would be necessary for complementary energy storage, going alongside renewables, such as critical materials like lithium, or even the critical materials used for construction of those generation sources themselves. So we've been evaluating a lot of these areas of application, these different solutions, looking at optimization of energy parks, solutions that incorporate multiple generation options to meet these multiple energy demands, and how we can do that with nuclear working alongside renewables, alongside carbon capture associated with fossil energy to meet these growing demands holistically and in a very clean, efficient fashion. So my bottom line message is that I encourage decision makers to consider these overall costs of energy solutions as we make those choices going forward. It will take all of these solutions to get to our end goals, and there are many additional externalities that we tend to miss if we purely look at capital costs. So I look forward to the discussion and questions that may arise. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Shannon. And Carl, we've mostly been talking about the United States so far, but climate change is obviously a global issue. Could you talk a little bit about your work and the role nuclear typically plays in these global modeling exercises involving decarbonization?
Yes, thanks, Matt. Be happy to. And I'm going to bring a little bit of a political economy perspective to this. Just first making the broad observation that I feel that there are two broad camps or tribes among nations, organizations, and people who are serious about solving climate change. Unfortunately, these two camps have very different views on nuclear. Camp one sees the need for a broad portfolio of solutions, including nuclear, and I would also throw in carbon capture and storage and technological carbon dioxide removal. And all of our panelists so far, I would say, including myself, are in that camp that we're going to need to bring the full portfolio of technologies. This includes the Biden administration and all of the things it's doing for climate change. By my last count, 14 of the G20 nations are in this camp. They have nuclear in their long-term strategy submitted to the Climate Convention, or they're planning on expanding nuclear. In this camp are the 25 countries that issued the declaration to triple nuclear energy by 2050, and that includes 5 of the G7 nations, and on and on. perhaps most importantly, it includes a perspective of the IPCC Workgroup 3. When you look at the full report, it is clearly in this camp. In their 1.5 degree scenarios, they have nuclear generation roughly doubling by 2050 on a median value basis. Maybe some scenarios showing small growth, or some scenarios showing quadrupling of nuclear generation by 2050 to solve the climate problem. Typically, the IPCC concluded that the global electricity generation mix is going to be 60, 70, 80% solar and wind, but complemented by nuclear. Gas with CCS or other fossil or other firm sources, the kind of portfolio that Jeff described at the outset. So that is where sort of the mainstream modeling analysis worldwide shows us we need to be, and how so many countries are lining up in that perspective. There is another camp number 2, that really wants to narrow the portfolio of solutions. They typically want to exclude nuclear from consideration. They view it as, safety risk, proliferation risks, waste disposal, those considering all those issues just not manageable. They often, in this camp, also oppose carbon capture and storage and technological CDR as well. But I'm going to focus on nuclear. Interestingly, this second camp often does not explicitly call for 100% renewable energy solutions to climate, but that's the implicit message, particularly when one observes them taking key options off the table. So I want to just give you 3 examples of what's been happening lately from sort of a political economy point of view, and camp number 2 taking options off the table. Let's pick up with the IPCC Workgroup 3 report. As many of you know, the final step in an IPCC process is the writing and approval of the Summary for Policymakers, or SPM. This is a consensus document that all nations must agree to, but it's pretty clear that some nations did not want any positive references to nuclear in that SPM. So the SPM has no depictions of the global generation mix. It has no quantitative depictions of the clean energy sources that must displace fossil fuels over the next 30 years. And the word nuclear itself virtually disappears from the SPM. Second example, the IPCC is intended to be a key foundation for the first global stocktake of progress toward the goals of the 2015 Paris Agreement, which of course culminated in COP28. And interestingly, the UNFCCC conducted a participatory stakeholder process over the past 2 years leading up to COP28. And last September, they issued their synthesis report of the technical dialogue of the first global stocktake. But the word nuclear completely disappears from this report. Zero, nada, no mention. In contrast to plenty of references to renewables, including solar, wind, as well as references to storage and efficiency. And then my final example, and then I'll shut up. Each year since 2010, the UN Environment Program has published the Emissions Gap Report, assessing the gap between where global emissions should be to limit warming and where they are actually headed. UNEP published their latest gap report in November, just before COP28. The word nuclear appears exactly once, just to note that Korea is expanding nuclear. Again, plenty of references to renewables, solar, wind, efficiency, etc. This ongoing downplaying or even erasure of nuclear from key documents distorts what mainstream analysis and modeling tell us about the role of nuclear in complementing variable renewable generation and enabling that rapid load growth that my previous panelists have talked to, and the rapid electrification of end uses across the economy that are essential to keeping warming at safe levels. Perhaps it's a minor miracle that nuclear did appear in the final COP statement last December, paragraph 28E. It listed nuclear among the technologies we need. But I would say stay tuned. These 2 camps are going to continue to battle over what options are on the table and off the table in battling for the hearts and minds of policymakers and the public at large.
All right, thank you, Carl. I'm going to say a couple of words. We're tracking behind, and I do want to get to some of these audience questions. I think we've now placed in the the feed a link to David Roberts' podcast with Julie's boss, Jigar Shah, where they discuss nuclear in quite some depth. For those of you joining via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those of you watching the live stream on Facebook, you can submit a question there. You can also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CJEPLive and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy. I'm just going to run through some of the questions I see here in the chat. I see one saying, why does the nuclear industry in the West appear to continually start construction without completed design documents, and therefore licensing, and therefore construction and supply chain scheduling issues? Jacobo, maybe I'd throw that in your direction. Some of these cost overruns way back in the 70s and 80s, and we still have this here. Why does this seem to be an issue in the West?
Well, I got my fingers crossed that at least with the new wave of construction like OPG, et cetera, they're not spending enormous amount of money before finishing the design. Hopefully that lesson from Vogtle, Summer, and the EPR projects in Europe has been learned. But focusing on those projects, why did they start without finishing construction? I think it's a mix of marketing and government aid deadlines. Specifically, the project at Olkiluoto, the first EPR in Finland, quite clearly was an attempt by then Arriva to sort of plant the flag and say, hey, I'm the first vendor to build in the so-called nuclear renaissance. And, speaking with fairly senior nuclear engineers in that company 10 years back, they all felt that they weren't ready. They just were promising a schedule and cost at a time when the design was not ready for prime time. Over here, I think there was a deadline for the application, not just the application, but for actually obtaining the loan guarantees from the U.S. government, from the Department of Energy, which might have put some pressure on the projects in Summer and Vogtle to start prior to completing the design. So that's my analysis of what has happened. Like I said, I hope going forward this is not going to happen again, because it would be inevitably the source of cost overruns and schedule delays again.
And I am speculating a bit here because that was before my time here at LPO, but I think the push for the tax credits was probably more of a driver than the LPO. And we at LPO certainly are very committed now for future projects, seeing and understanding the path to having all of that in place before moving forward.
And Julie, we have a question directed to you. You said the most serious conversations you've had with utilities in the past 3 months have been about building AP1000s, and Westinghouse has said a similar thing, but no utilities have come out saying they're thinking about this. Does this secretiveness demonstrate something about public perception risk and PSC perception risk in light of the Vogtle VC Summer experience? If so, what could change these perceptions enough to allow utilities to be public?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's three things. I think it's one, it is this emotional, immediate reaction that nuclear generates from folks that sometimes makes having an informed discussion difficult. So I think that causes a level of apprehension from the utilities. I think that the second thing is that they are struggling with exactly what Shannon mentioned, that everyone is so focused on LCOE that they've driven us down a path of just building a bunch of natural gas with a little bit of solar instead of actually accounting for the system costs of decarbonizing resiliently. And I think also that PUCs are lacking some of the quantitative tools that would allow them to make those decisions. So I think the solution to both of those is around storytelling, right? It's around explaining the costs at Vogtle, and that it's not that nuclear is impossible to deliver on time and on budget, but explaining the sources of those issues and why they're preventable going forward. And the second piece is explaining why it is cheaper to decarbonize with nuclear, that if you try to do it with only intermittent resources, you will have to so overbuild the transmission, so overbuild the storage, use long duration storage that we don't really have commercially available right now, that the system costs will be much more expensive than doing it with clean, firm sources like nuclear. So really hoping that the updated liftoff report will hopefully help answer some of those storytelling challenges that folks are having.
And thank you. And Shannon, if I can throw a question your direction, one of the questions is, the panelists have focused on versions of the light water reactor. What are their views on fourth generation nuclear using different coolants such as molten salt or lead? Should governments invest money to accelerate the development of fourth generation? And maybe that ties into, you had mentioned something about hydrogen.
Yeah, absolutely. So we need everything. We need to keep our current fleet operating. We need to leverage the learnings that we've had from building light water reactors and operating light water reactors, but we need higher temperature reactors that come in various sizes and application modes to really get to this end goal. Higher temperature reactors will give us higher efficiency of electricity production and gain some efficiencies there. They can also be coupled with some of these higher temperature process heat users in industry. When it comes to hydrogen, I saw a question as well relating to coupling of nuclear with solid oxide systems, and that's one of the primary areas we are focused on. So right now, 95% of the hydrogen that we use today comes from steam methane reforming. So a lot of emissions associated with breaking down that methane into the hydrogen and its co-product there of CO2. The primary path we're looking at for hydrogen in the United States is electrolysis, whether through low temperature water electrolysis that renewables support very, very well, or through high temperature electrolysis, such as solid oxide electrolysis systems. By going to these higher temperature systems, we can get about 30% more efficiency in how we produce that hydrogen, lower energy requirement, but it still requires a lot of electricity. So it really comes down to what is the price of that electricity, and that really does drive the price of that hydrogen. There's been some common misconceptions historically that to operate these high temperature electrolysis systems, you need a high temperature reactor. That's not entirely true. Those systems operate at 700 to 800 degrees Celsius, but they're very efficient at utilizing 150 degrees steam that can be provided by a light water reactor or a high temperature reactor. But again, those high temperature reactors will give us more efficiencies in reducing the cost of the electricity production. So there are benefits, but it's not that we can't do it with lower temperature reactors because of the heat recuperation within the system itself, getting to those higher temperatures. So bottom line, we need to invest in all of these technologies. There are places for the current fleet. There are places for large scale AP1000 type systems, but there are also solutions in the advanced reactor space that will provide even more efficiency, allow us to locate those systems right by the energy user, and thus gain some efficiencies on co-location as well.
Okay, thank you. And unfortunately, with apologies to Carl and all of our other questions that I don't think we're going to have time to get to, I think I have to shut off the discussion now since we are at the hour. I want to thank each of our panelists, as well as Mr. Lyash, for joining us today. Thank you to the audience for tuning in and for your questions. As mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on our website in a few days. Our next event, Careers in Energy Policy, will be held on March 14th, 2024, from 6 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. at the National Union Building in Washington, D.C. For a full calendar of upcoming events, please visit the Center on Global Energy Policy's website. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.